Hello. In this video, I will be discussing a question that, unsurprisingly, nobody I'm aware of has asked before. Namely, who do the souls who aren't 22 in the movie Soul become? There are a total of 7 souls we have enough information about to deduce aspects of their personality. Namely, 22 themselves, the 3 souls who have speaking roles, the Archer, the soul inspired by the Hall of You, and the Photographer. Plenty of people have already given their opinion on who 22 becomes. Every notable theorist I can think of, with the exception of MatPat and Seamus Gorman, has published a video or article on this. Of these, I find Super Carlin Brothers' thesis the most compelling. However, this topic has already been well trod, so this video will not focus on this. The Archer, the Photographer, and the person who discovers their spark in the Hall of You all have their boxes shown, but as I do not have access to the Art of Soul book, I am incapable of deducing with any semblance of certainty their personality traits, so I will not be discussing these souls in this video either. This leaves the 3 souls who described themselves in the film shown to Joe Gardner and the other prospective mentors as part of their briefing session. For a refresher, the first of these souls is an agreeable skeptic who's cautious yet flamboyant. The second of these souls is an irritable wallflower who's dangerously curious. And the third of these souls is a manipulative megalomaniac who's intensely opportunistic. Finally, the Jerry in the film says of the third soul, "Oh ho, this one might be a handful." But that's Earth's problem. Unfortunately, that's all we have to go on. These souls could be literally anyone in the Pixar universe. So we're going to have to assume we know these characters. That's still a lot of people, animals, and machines, though, so I went through all the Pixar characters I could think of, and I think I've managed to narrow it down to a manageable level. For the first soul, there are 13 candidates. Namely, Roz from Monsters, Inc., Rex from Toy Story, Doc Hudson from Cars, Edna from The Incredibles, Joe from Soul, Bailey from Finding Dory, P.T. Flea from A Bug's Life, Mike from Monsters, Inc., Cruz from Cars 3, Carl from Up, Anton Ego from Ratatouille, Paul from Soul, and Mama Imelda from Coco. For the second soul, there are 8 candidates. Namely, Merida from Brave, Hank from Finding Dory, Carl from Up, Arlo from The Good Dinosaur, Violet from The Incredibles, Randall from Monsters, Inc., Marlin from Finding Nemo, and Riley from Inside Out. For the third soul, well, Jerry basically said they were going to be a villain, so I decided to include all 25 standard villains, namely Sid, Al, Stinky Pete, Hopper, Randall, Waternoose, Syndrome, Chick Hicks, Anton Ego, Skinner, Otto, Mordu, Ernesto de la Cruz, Thunderclap, the Rustlers, Zundap, Dean Hardscrabble, Sterling, Jackson Storm, Gabby Gabby, Johnny Worthington, Charles Muntz, Evelyn Dever, Axelrod, and Lotso Huggin Bear. To help me narrow this list down, I decided to put all of these candidates into respective tournaments. Due to the fact that the numbers of candidates for the first and third soul are non-binary, I decided to give Joe, Carl, Anton Ego, Syndrome, Mordu, Ernesto de la Cruz, Lotso, Evelyn Dever, Axelrod, and Charles Muntz buys. Let's start with the second soul, since they're the smallest number of candidates. First, let's compare Merida and Hank. Merida and Hank are both pretty irritable. Merida is frequently agitated by her mother, and Hank is moody throughout his film. Although Merida and Hank aren't exactly what you might call wallflowers, I think we can all agree neither are the most socially apt characters. However, while Merida is so curious about the will of the wisps, she ends up meeting the witch. Hank is not in any way curious, so Merida moves on. Next, let's compare Carl and Arlo. Both are quite often irritated by the protagonist of their film. Both Carl and Arlo are definite introverts, although Carl's introversion is more pronounced. And while Arlo is curious, Carl's desire to go to the Paradise Falls shows he's perhaps more curious than even Arlo. So Carl moves on. Now, let's compare Violet and Randall. Violet is essentially the textbook definition of an irritable wallflower. And while Randall is irritable and socially awkward, as shown in Monsters University, he actively pursues a social life. Violet also shows much more curiosity than Randall ever does, so Violet moves on. Now let's compare Marlin and Riley. Both seem to be introverted and more likely to watch than participate in conversation. However, this is more pronounced in Marlin. Neither display exceptional curiosity. Both are easily irritated, although from what we see from Riley's past, this has less to do with her soul and more to do with scuffles between her emotions. So Marlin moves on. In the semifinals, we now have Merida, Carl, Violet, and Marlin. Now let's compare Merida and Carl. Carl seems much more irritable than Merida, and more closely fits what one might think of as a wallflower. Merida, however, shows more curiosity, I would say, than Carl. Nevertheless, Carl wins on 2 of the categories, so he moves on. Now, while Violet fits all 3 categories, Marlin does not demonstrate much curiosity, so Violet moves on. Our finals are now with Carl and Violet. Violet's defensiveness and introvertedness, considering her power sets, seem to be key aspects of her personality. On the other hand, while Carl seems to be on par with Violet, pun intended, in terms of introversion, and Carl is easily irritated, it seems more likely that his irritability has to do with age. Violet and Carl seem to demonstrate similar levels of curiosity. Violet wins in one category and ties in the other 2. So therefore, I would conclude Violet most closely matches the personality of the second soul. Let's do the third soul next, because this one is a bit more straightforward. First, let's compare Sid and Owl. While Sid is somewhat opportunistic, he shows no megalomaniacal tendencies, only psychopathic tendencies, and is not in any way manipulative. Al, on the other hand, is very opportunistic and is somewhat manipulative, although he shows no megalomaniacal tendencies. So Al moves on. Now let's compare Stinky Pete and Hopper. Neither of them quite show intense narcissism, and neither of them seem to be quite opportunistic. However, while Hopper is not particularly manipulative, relying mostly on brute force and fear, Stinky Pete is very manipulative, so Stinky Pete moves on. Now let's compare Randall and Waternoose. I think we can all agree Waternoose is significantly more manipulative than Randall. In fact, the theorizer has ascertained that Waternoose is in fact manipulating Randall throughout Monsters, Inc. While Randall does show some megalomaniacal tendencies, they are much more apparent in Waternoose. Neither Randall nor Waternoose seem particularly opportunistic, but that doesn't particularly matter, as Waternoose already has an advantage in the other 2 categories. So, therefore, Waternoose moves on. Now let's compare Chick Hicks and Anton Ego. Anton Ego, while a narcissist not only by deed but by name, doesn't strike me as particularly manipulative or opportunistic. Chick Hicks is definitely a narcissist, and while not particularly manipulative, is a great taker of opportunities. Therefore, Chick Hicks moves on. Now, let's compare Otto and Chef Skinner. Otto is manipulative, but is definitely not a taker of opportunities. Otto additionally demonstrates no megalomania during WALL-E. Skinner, unlike Otto, is both manipulative and opportunistic. He additionally is narcissistic and craves power. Therefore, Chef Skinner moves on. Now, let's compare Thunderclap and the Rustlers. The Rustlers do not exhibit really any of the 3 qualities shown in the third soul. On the other hand, Thunderclap's motto, "The storm provides," is all about opportunity. And while not a megalomaniac, we can conclude that he's manipulative from his interactions with Arlo. So Thunderclap moves on. Now, let's compare Professor Zundap and Dean Hardscrabble. Zundap demonstrates a lot of manipulative behavior. On the other hand, Dean Hardscrabble is more direct. Zundap additionally shows more megalomania than Hardscrabble, and his actions toward the end of Cars 2 show he is also quite opportunistic. Therefore, Professor Zundap moves on. Now, let's compare Sterling and Jackson Storm. Both Sterling and Jackson Storm demonstrate both manipulative and narcissistic tendencies. However, while Sterling is opportunistic, Jackson Storm is not. Therefore, Sterling moves on. Now, let's compare Gabby Gabby and Johnny Worthington. Gabby Gabby is very manipulative and is able to get her voice box only by manipulating Woody. She is also very opportunistic, shown by her interactions with both Woody and Harmony. She, however, demonstrates no megalomania. Johnny Worthington is a bit manipulative, shown through the party scene, but is nowhere near as manipulative as Gabby Gabby. He's a narcissist, but is not particularly opportunistic. Gabby Gabby wins in 2 categories, so she moves on. So now we have Al, Stinky Pete, Waternoose, Syndrome, Chick Hicks, Skinner, Mordu, Lotso, Thunderclap, Professor Zundap, Sterling, Gabby Gabby, Charles Muntz, Evelyn Dever, Axelrod, and Ernesto de la Cruz. Let's compare Al and Stinky Pete. As noted before, while Al demonstrates 2 of the qualities, Stinky Pete only demonstrates 1, so Al moves on. Now, let's compare Waternoose and Syndrome. Waternoose and Syndrome are both very manipulative, as shown by Waternoose's manipulation of Soli and Syndrome's manipulation of who knows how many supers. However, Syndrome is both more narcissistic and more opportunistic than Waternoose. Therefore, Syndrome moves on. Now, let's compare Chick Hicks and Skinner. As noted before, Skinner fulfills all 3 categories, while Chick Hicks only satisfies 2. Therefore, Chef Skinner moves on. Now, let's compare Mordu and Lotso. Lotso is extremely manipulative, and as shown through controlling Buzz, he is also very opportunistic. However, he's not by any means a megalomaniac. Mordu is virtually the definition of a megalomaniac, and he, as shown in the Legend of Mordu, is also extremely opportunistic. However, although he is portrayed as somewhat manipulative in the Legend of Mordu, he is nowhere near as manipulative as Lotso. Nevertheless, Mordu, through his strength in the other categories, fits the description of the third soul more closely than Lotso. So Mordu moves on. Now, let's compare Thunderclap and Professor Zundap. Zundap, as noted before, fits all 3 categories, while Thunderclap only satisfies 2. However, Thunderclap wins in both the categories he fits, so Thunderclap moves on. Now, let's compare Gabby Gabby and Sterling. While Gabby Gabby is more manipulative than Sterling, Sterling is both more megalomaniacal and opportunistic than Gabby Gabby. Therefore, Sterling moves on. Now, let's compare Evelyn Dever and Charles Muntz. Neither Dever nor Muntz are exactly megalomaniacs, and both are very opportunistic. However, Muntz is not very manipulative, while Dever is. So Evelyn Dever moves on. Now, let's compare Axelrod and Ernesto de la Cruz. Both Ernesto de la Cruz and Axelrod are very manipulative and very narcissistic. However, Ernesto de la Cruz is the definition of opportunistic, while Axelrod is not. Therefore, Ernesto de la Cruz moves on. In the quarterfinals, we now have Al, Syndrome, Chef Skinner, Mordu, Thunderclap, Sterling, the Screenslaver, and Ernesto de la Cruz. Let's compare Al and Syndrome. While they are similarly opportunistic, Syndrome demonstrates much more manipulative behavior and megalomaniacal personality than Al, so Syndrome moves on. Now, let's compare Chef Skinner and Mordu. Mordu is less manipulative than Skinner, but is much more of a megalomaniac and opportunist, so Mordu moves on. Let's compare Thunderclap and Sterling. Sterling, as noted before, fits all 3 categories, while Thunderclap only satisfies 2. However, Thunderclap is so much more opportunistic and manipulative than Sterling that I would say he more closely fits the description of the third soul than Sterling. Therefore, Thunderclap moves on. Now let's compare Evelyn Dever and Ernesto de la Cruz. Evelyn Dever is more manipulative than Ernesto de la Cruz. However, Ernesto de la Cruz is more opportunistic than Dever. Additionally, he shows some megalomaniacal tendencies, while the Screenslaver does not. Therefore, Ernesto de la Cruz moves on. In the semifinals, we have Syndrome, Mordu, Thunderclap, and Ernesto de la Cruz. Mordu, as stated before, is the definition of a megalomaniac, but Syndrome has a god complex, so they are comparable on that level. They are additionally similarly opportunistic. However, Syndrome demonstrates much more manipulation than the brute force-oriented Mordu. Therefore, Syndrome moves on. Now, let's compare Thunderclap and Ernesto de la Cruz. Both characters are opportunistic on the deepest level. However, Thunderclap is not as manipulative or narcissistic as Ernesto de la Cruz. Therefore, Ernesto de la Cruz moves on and joins the finals with Syndrome. Ernesto de la Cruz is about as manipulative as Syndrome, it seems, and is more opportunistic than Syndrome by about the same amount that Syndrome is more of a megalomaniac than Ernesto de la Cruz. It seems like a tie at this point. So you must consider the fact that the soul was significant enough to be featured in a film directed towards mentors, and ask whether Ernesto de la Cruz or Syndrome was more influential. Ernesto de la Cruz, as shown by his lavish life in the land of the dead, is shown to be an extremely influential character. However, when the Pixar theory is taken into account, Syndrome is shown to be perhaps even more important than Boo in terms of determining the timeline. Beyond his own film and his sequel, he and his 0-point energy are the only reason the events of the Toy Story franchise, the Cars franchise, WALL-E, A Bug's Life, Monsters Inc., Monsters University, and perhaps Onward even occur in the first place. And he also heavily influences the events of Up and Brave as well. He is the individual most directly responsible for the apocalypse. Therefore, it seems most likely that the third soul is Syndrome. Now, let's look at the first soul. First, let's compare Roz and Rex. Roz is not particularly agreeable, but she is somewhat skeptical or flamboyant and less cautious than less cautious. But she is somewhat skeptical and cautious. I've already established in a previous video that the bloopers are not canon, but they suggest she is flamboyant as well. Rex, while agreeable, is not skeptical or flamboyant and less cautious than Roz. Therefore, Roz moves on. Now, let's compare Doc Hudson and Edna. Doc Hudson, as shown by his acceptance of Lightning McQueen, is at least somewhat agreeable, although this process took a lot of convincing, so he can be considered as a skeptic as well. While Edna is a skeptic, her absolute distaste of supermodels and her extremely high standards show she is not particularly agreeable. Doc Hudson demonstrates both caution and flamboyance in his race with Lightning McQueen, and while Edna does demonstrate a lot of flamboyance in her outfits, she does not demonstrate any more caution than is absolutely necessary. Therefore, Doc Hudson moves on. Now, let's compare Bailey and P.T. Flea. Both seem quite agreeable by the end of their films, but both are skeptical, P.T. Flea of his troop and Bailey of his ability to echolocate. Both demonstrate caution, although Bailey demonstrates more. Bailey is not, though, flamboyant, while P.T. Flea is. Therefore, P.T. Flea moves on. Now, let's compare Mike Wazowski and Cruz. Both demonstrate agreeable qualities, and both are skeptical in the beginning of their film. Both demonstrate a lot of caution, although Cruz demonstrates more caution with regard to pushing others than with regard to herself. Both are somewhat flamboyant, although Mike is more so. Therefore, as Mike more closely fits two categories, he moves on. Now let's compare Paul and Imelda. Both Paul and Imelda are somewhat agreeable by the end of the film, Imelda more so. Imelda also demonstrates much more skepticism of music than Paul does of Joe, although this may be due to the fact that Imelda is simply given more screen time. Neither demonstrate much caution, although this lack is more pronounced in Paul than Imelda, and both possess similar amounts of flamboyance. Therefore, Imelda moves on. Thus, in the quarterfinals, there are Roz, Doc Hudson, Joe, P.T. Flea, Mike, Carl, Anton Ego, and Mama Imelda. Now, let's compare Roz and Doc Hudson. As shown before, Doc Hudson matches all the personality traits, while Roz only matches 2 or 3. So Doc Hudson moves on. Now, let's compare Joe and P.T. Flea. Joe seems to be somewhat agreeable. Well, he is at first very skeptical about a number of things, most definitely the possibility that his spark isn't jazz. Joe is also very cautious and often restrains 22 from doing things without thinking them through. And Joe throughout the film shows flamboyance to some degree. Joe is more agreeable and more skeptical, I would say, than P.T. Flea, and while he's less flamboyant, he's more cautious. Therefore, Joe moves on. Now, let's compare Mike and Carl. Carl throughout Up shows agreeability, skepticism, and caution. Additionally, he lifts his house at the beginning in a very showy manner. However, while Mike and Carl demonstrate similar levels of agreeability, skepticism, and caution, Mike demonstrates more flamboyance. Therefore, Mike moves on. Now, let's compare Anton, Ego, and Imelda. Ego and Imelda show similar levels of agreeability near the end of their films, but Ego seems much more skeptical about the ability of food to impress him than Imelda does of music. Both demonstrate similar levels of caution, but being the grim eater, Ego is more flamboyant than Imelda. Therefore, Anton Ego moves on. Thus, in the semifinals, we have Doc Hudson, Joe Gardner, Mike Wazowski, and Anton Ego. Now let's compare Doc Hudson and Joe Gardner. They seem to demonstrate similar levels of agreeability, skepticism, and flamboyance, but Joe seems more cautious than Doc Hudson, especially in Doc's earlier years. Therefore, Joe moves on. Now, let's compare Anton Ego and Mike Wazowski. Anton Ego seems, by the end of the film, more agreeable than Mike, and throughout the film is more of a skeptic than Mike. Mike demonstrates more caution, but Ego demonstrates more flamboyance. Therefore, Anton Ego moves on and joins Joe in the finals. Anton Ego is less agreeable and less cautious than Joe, but is more skeptical and more flamboyant. Therefore, it seems like, as in the previous portion, there is a tie. Thus, we turn to significance. Neither Anton Ego nor Joe Gardner seem quite as significant as Syndrome in life. However, we know that Joe Gardner was capable of throwing off Terry's count, that he was the first person capable of that in centuries. Therefore, Joe is more significant, and it seems more likely that the soul Joe saw in the film was in fact himself, before he was born and found a spark. We have now reached our conclusion, it seems. The souls who speak in the briefing film shown to the mentors in Soul are Joe Gardner, Violet Parr, and Buddy Pine. However, something didn't quite sit right with me. Of course, of these, Violet Parr doesn't really fit in. Yes, she is a powerful super, but interviewed before her was a soul who would go on to not only throw off the count, but be essentially resurrected from the dead twice. And interviewed after her was a soul who would go on to cause the apocalypse and single-handedly steer not only the Earth, but an entirely different planet into a whole new direction. So she doesn't seem quite a significant enough soul to be interviewed in the film. Of course, this leaves the question of, if not Violet, who is the second soul? The runner-up Carl would seem to be the obvious choice, but Carl is even less significant in the Pixar universe than Violet. In fact, none of the candidates seem particularly significant. So instead, we might look not necessarily for the traits, but for significance. And obviously the first person that comes to mind is Boo. So could the second soul be Boo? Of course she is definitely significant enough. In fact, if Isaac Carlson's theory that Boo is the one who threw off the count before Joe is correct, she would bridge the gap between Joe, who threw off the count but did not alter the course of the universe and went before her, and Syndrome, who did not throw off the count but did alter the course of the universe and went after her. But is she an irritable wallflower who's dangerously curious? And interestingly enough, yes. While she does not seem to be an irritable wallflower in Monsters, Inc., she does appear in another film, Brave, as the witch. She lives as a recluse and definitely seems like she could be a wallflower. She additionally seems very irritated when Merida asks for a spell. She doesn't seem dangerously curious and brave, but she exhibits this trait very strongly in Monsters, Inc., and this trait is the reason why she even enters the monsters realm. And now, we have finally reached our actual conclusion. The agreeable skeptic who's cautious but flamboyant is Joe Gardner. The irritable wallflower who's dangerously curious is Mary Gibbs. And the manipulative megalomaniac who's intensely opportunistic is Buddy Pine. If you agree, let me know in the comments. And if you disagree, let me know in the comments. And otherwise, au revoir.